Hello, this is social media attorney Mark Fiedholz, and welcome to my podcast entitled How to Mitigate the Risk Exposure of Employee Venting on Social Media. I think it's safe to say that social media is here to stay, and emerging social media networks will continue to grow. That means employees will have more options to vent their opinions and jokes without much employer oversight. For instance, in addition to the popularity of homegrown podcasts and live streaming, audio social media platforms are now becoming very popular. Apps such as Clubhouse and Spaces are drop in audio chat apps with a focus on creating social chat rooms, which are spaces for casually chatting with friends and other interesting people. Now, on the surface, the audio chat apps seem like innocent venues for people to mimic, or rather to bond together, a group of friends with common interests, hanging out. The audio apps create real time interactive chat rooms for topical discussions. You can communicate with close friends, have an open format digital panel, plan a party, start a club, give a sermon, or just meet some new people. So, again, on the surface, it seems pretty cool. But here's the problem for employers. Employees using their private social media accounts now have another powerful social media communication tool to vent their opinions and jokes without much oversight from the employer. More specifically, if an employee decides to move to the dark side and create content that is defamatory, harassing, discriminatory, or obscene, especially to a coworker or vendor, then the employer can face big time liability exposure. More importantly, if the comments go viral, you could suffer permanent reputational damage and lose the public trust. So there's a lot at risk here. Is this an intractable problem with no solution? Now, my answer to that is absolutely not. You can solve this problem. Here are a few tips to mitigate both the employee and employer's liability from employee costly social media mistakes. First, First point, rather. Let's destroy the myth that you aren't liable for off duty speech on private social media networks and devices, especially if it's work related. From a public image standpoint, an employee's defamatory, harassing, or biased comment could destroy your reputation, especially when the comments can reach millions and become a permanent digital footprint. But now let's talk about the nexus of liability, all right, for the legal fallout. An employee's social media post or tweet, all right, that's not covered by the First Amendment can translate into $500,000 plus legal damages for the employer. Now, look, even if you're insured, all right, your premiums are going to skyrocket. It's just not a good thing. But we need to destroy this myth that you aren't liable or employer is not liable for off duty speech on private social media networks and devices. Remember this, all the courts look at is content. They don't care what phone you're using. They don't care if you're on duty, off duty, especially if it's work related. All right. And, just keep that in mind. All right. Second point. Now that you know you can't bury your head in the sand on the issue of mitigating risk from off duty speech on private social media networks, you can begin to marshal your resources to address the problem. That's the biggest thing. A lot of companies and a lot of public sector employers I deal with before I arrived, or they were making my course mandatory, my online course mandatory, they just didn't want to deal with it. All right. And they were also, there was a lot of smoke and mirrors. They were living under the myth that they only had to train their social media manager, public information officer, spokesperson, and that they weren't responsibility for off duty speech. And it really caused a lot of problems and gave them a lot of exposure. All right. So, again, I feel there's only one cost effective solution. You need to make my online or live social media liability course mandatory for all employees. All right. And that leads me to the third point, right? Because the third point is basically saying that the court of public opinion and court of law recognizes that you can't control every on duty or off duty post or tweet on a private social media network. However, what you can control, though, and the courts now require it, by the way. I mean, you can't just hand out a social media policy and say, have a nice day. All right. You must enforce that social media policy with outside expert social media liability training. And by the way, the reason I say outside expert social media law training, from somebody who is not an in-house attorney, because most in-house attorneys don't have my experience as a 30-year digital media law specialist and haven't trained 100,000 public and private sector employees. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd to expect your in-house attorney to have my experience. And it doesn't happen. Now, most in-house attorneys are extremely busy, but the best they can do is hand out the policy, talk about it a little bit, give a few general warnings, but it's not going to be good enough. All right. So you need to make sure, and this is the key here, that you have documentation that your instructor was an experienced social media law expert like myself that can give employees in-depth information and strategies on avoiding hidden liabilities of the new social media defamation, First Amendment, invasion of privacy, and copyright infringement laws. Remember, your employees are new broadcasters and publishers who are in dire need of this type of media liability training. You can't just say be a social media ambassador and then leave them hanging without any liability training. And the liability training can't just be verbal warnings. It has to be in-depth information, of course, for non-lawyers, right? But you need somebody like me who has not only the teaching ability, but the experience to look under the hood and say, hey, there's some nuances here that you need to know as well. All right. And you're just not going to get that at conferences or anywhere else. All right. So you deal with the counter arguments here, right? I mean, because you are making financial determinations on whether to make my online course mandatory or not. All right. So usually what somebody will say is that well, listen, even with your course, they can still make mistakes, right? Well, that's a ridiculous argument because first, without my expert social media liability training, your employees have a much higher risk of making social media mistakes that destroy your public image and trigger big legal damages. I remember one department that I worked with in Mississippi, and they had said, you can't solve every problem with Mark's training, but what you can do is have documentation to show that you did train, which works on a lot of levels. And you definitely gave us more armor. All right. And you mitigated the employees' risk exposure as well. But the second point here is, to me, is the most important. All right. And it's not that mitigating employees' liability exposure is not important, but for an employer, this is the most important. When you make my online course, social media liability course, mandatory for all employees, you now have documented proof, all right, that you enforced your social media and other digital media policies with expert employee training, not just verbal warnings, not just busy in-house attorneys coming in, rereading the social media policy, is that you cared enough to show due diligence to have a course like mine. I mean, I'm a nationally recognized social media attorney, so it wasn't just like you just picked somebody impromptu. All right. And that shows a lot. It shows the court due diligence, like I said, which can defeat negligent claims. But more importantly, it also shows the public that you deeply, deeply care about social media mistakes, that you want to give your employees the highest quality social media liability education to avoid violating the civil and constitutional rights of others. All right, look, as we move closer to the end of this podcast, I want to reemphasize the risks of waiting around for a lawsuit or thinking your busy attorney can duplicate what it took me 30 years to do. You're running out of time, okay? You can't wait anymore. These lawsuits are huge. You're going to destroy the public trust. All right. And if you're in the public sector, it's going to be citizens. If you're in the private sector, it's going to be your customers. You're going to lose your legitimacy. Again, if you can't solve every problem, even after my training, somebody may make a mistake, but at least you can show documented proof that you cared enough to provide high quality training, and you'll get a lot of mileage out of it. All right. So we are at the end of this podcast. I hope I convince you enough to immediately register all your people for my online course. It's very low cost. And I want to thank you for your time. And that's the end of this podcast.